Welcome to Equip, Build, and Mature. Again, my background is not what is normal. We are in Mountain Home, Arkansas. I want to share a word of encouragement with you as I normally do on Tuesdays. Sometimes the most powerful thing that you and I can bring to God is not our strength, it's not our talent, it's not all of our so-called achievements. Sometimes the most powerful thing that you and I can bring to God is simply our need of Him. The gospel reveals something very surprising about how God works. He does not wait for people to become full before He takes action. Over and over, repeatedly in God's Word, we see that God steps into situations where there is nothing left, and that is where His provision begins. One of the clearest pictures of this is seen in the story of a widow during the time of God's prophet Elisha. Her situation was desperate. Her husband had died, and he left such a severe debt that creditors were about to take her two sons as slaves. Her life had collapsed into fear and uncertainty. It says in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 2, Elisha asked her, "What can I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" She said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." So as we read that, we understand she was not presenting a list of resources. She was admitting she had almost nothing. Then Elisha gave her a very unusual order in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 3. He said, "Go out and borrow empty containers from all of your neighbors, and do not get just a few." So the miracle did not begin with abundance. God's miraculous work began with empty jars. The widow and her sons went from house to house collecting containers. They went back home and poured their small amount of oil into the jars, and an amazing thing happened. The oil kept flowing. One jar filled, then another, and it continued. So God, through His word, said that the oil continued to flow until every single jar that they had collected was full. The oil stopped only when there were no more empty jars. We see this in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 6. The supply did not run out. The oil continued to flow until there were no more jars left to receive the oil. Years later, another event happened that echoed a similar pattern. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, He attended a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And during that celebration, the host, horror of horrors, the host ran out of wine. And in that culture, that would have been so deeply embarrassing. So Jesus told the servants what to do. The text says there were 6 stone water jars available and they were used for Jewish purification rituals. And each jar held 20 or 30 gallons. We read of this in John chapter 2, verse 6. So they were ordinary jars, used for washing, not for celebration. Yet Jesus chose those jars as the setting for His first miracle. The servants filled the jars with water as Jesus told them to do. Then Jesus told them to pour some and give it to the master of the feast. When they tasted the water, it had become wine. What had once been ordinary jars suddenly held something far greater than what had been placed inside them. When you look at those stories together, a beautiful pattern emerges. In both situations, the jars themselves did not produce the miracle. The jars had no ability to create oil. The stone jars had no power to turn water into wine. The miracle came from the one who provided what filled the jars. See, this thread of thought quietly points to the finished work of Jesus. Many people assume they must first fill themselves with enough righteousness, or fill themselves with enough self-discipline, or fill themselves with enough spiritual strength before God can actually work in their lives. But the gospel says something completely, totally different. The life of God does not come from human effort. The life of God flows from Jesus. God, through his revealed word, says in John chapter 1, verse 16, we have all received grace upon grace from his fullness. The source of everything that Jesus' covenant disciple receives is not what we supply, not what we can achieve. It's what God supplies, and it's what God will achieve through us and in us. So neither our effort to produce or supply, nor our emptiness qualifies us for God's work. The cross has already secured the grace that we need. Jesus has already provided the fullness that his covenant disciples now rely on. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, the barrier between God and humanity, it has been removed. And now the life of God is now given freely to those who surrender their all to him and live in faithful obedience to what his word says. So when that widow in the time of Elisha, when she gathered jars, she did not create the miracle. She obeyed and received what God provided. When the servants filled the stone jars, they did not produce the wine. They only witnessed what Jesus transformed. In the same way, the life of a covenant disciple of Jesus does not produce the spiritual life. We receive the life that flows from Jesus. This is why the finished work of Jesus changes everything. Jesus' covenant disciples are no longer striving to prove that we are enough. We live from the fullness of what Jesus has already accomplished. The grace of God does not begin when we finally become strong enough. No, the grace of God begins because Jesus has already finished the work. What once looked empty in our lives becomes the very place where his provision appears. Not because emptiness earns the miracle, but because Jesus himself is the source of everything that fills the emptiness in our lives. The widow's oil continued until every jar was full. The water at Cana became the best wine at the feast. Both stories quietly whisper the same truth. The gospel loudly declares, what Jesus supplies is greater than our emptiness. And because of what Jesus accomplished on the cross, the life we now receive from him will never run dry. Guys, thanks for sharing a few moments with me. Hope you have a great Tuesday, and may God continue to bless us as we seek to let him fill our emptiness. Take care.